Hello, everyone. Welcome to Imago Day. I'm Andres Vasquez, and today I'm here with Dr. Darrell Bock to talk about a very important topic, the deity of Jesus. So, thank you, Dr. Bock, for being here with me.
It's good to be with you.
And as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about the deity of Christ, which I consider one of the important issues within Christianity. We'll talk about what it entails, answer some objections, and more. But before we get right into the topic, I would like you to introduce yourself to those who don't know you or don't know what you do.
Okay. I'm a senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, in the United States. I'm also executive director for cultural engagement at the Howard G. Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership at the seminary. I've written probably over 40 or edited over 45 books. Several are commentaries on the Gospels. I've done a special study of Jesus's life and ministry called Jesus According to Scripture, and the other one's called Jesus God-Man, two separate works. And I've spent, I'm in my 41st year at the seminary, and I've spent almost all of it in the Gospels.
Great. And quickly, I'd like you to share with us your faith journey. How did you become a Christian?
Yeah, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I came to faith between my freshman and sophomore year in college after several different people tried to share Christ with me. And then, so it was something that was well thought out by the point when the Lord did grab me and brought me to himself. And then ended up in seminary here in Dallas, then did my doctoral work in Scotland, in Aberdeen, Scotland, came back and have taught at Dallas ever since. And then went to, I've been 4 separate single years in Germany doing what we call postgraduate study. So I've spent a lot of time in Europe as well as in the United States. And then I minister globally. Every summer, I'm usually away anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 months overseas in different parts of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Bock, for sharing with us. And as a first question, why do you think it is important for Christians to affirm the divinity of Jesus?
Well, because at the heart of the Christian faith is the life and ministry of Jesus, including his ability to carry out promises that God has made with regard to salvation. And in relationship to that, then to execute those promises. So he has to have the power and authority to be able to do that. So the divinity of Jesus is important because of the central role that he plays in salvation, not just the work on the cross, but beyond that, the work that he does now in sending the Spirit to those who believe, the advocacy work that he does on our behalf as children of Christ. There's just a myriad of things that he does that are dependent to a great degree on the idea that Jesus is the most unique human being who's ever walked incarnate. He is the Word become flesh.
And as a Christian, our primary source for the life of Jesus is the Gospels, However, they may not be the same, for other people, especially for non-believers. So can we be sure that what the Gospels say is true?
Yes, I mean, the Gospels, I think, are very, very trustworthy. The core story is certainly trustworthy, written by 2 apostles and 2 people who are around the apostles. The tradition associated with Jesus is tied to people who spent a lot of time with Jesus. And if you're around someone virtually every day for 3.5 years, you know what they teach and what they think. And Jesus was equipping his disciples for this role, so it was an intentional role that they have. And so the Gospels can be trusted.
Yeah, moreover, they were eyewitnesses, right? So we can be sure of.
Yeah, they were eyewitnesses, and you know, it's not just a matter of memory, because sometimes memory can leak. You know, memory, sometimes we forget things or shuffle things around. But the fact that you have many people who have experienced the same event and who have undertaken to understand what Jesus is about means that there are many memories operating together in terms of what's going on in the tradition in the Gospels.
And why do you think there are people or religions that try to, deny the divinity of Jesus?
Well, I mean, they're denying. I mean, in some ways, I want to say they're denying the obvious, but what I want to say is that they're denying the core claims that these apostles were making about Jesus, who came out of Judaism, were not expecting to believe in a Messiah who they viewed as God. So something had to convince them of that. And the claims that you often get, say, from Islam in particular, that the texts are corrupt, or that that we don't have the right text, that they've been distorted in one way or another, doesn't reflect the depth of the tradition of the manuscript evidence that we have for the wording of our text and for the clarity of that wording. So, so some of the objections don't have historical merit, and then other objections are just slow to appreciate the depth of the value of the material that we have in the Gospels.
Now, I would like to talk about the evidence we have for the divinity of Jesus. In this way, could you mention some direct and indirect statements of Jesus about his divinity?
Yeah, well, there are really just a handful of direct statements. Before Abraham was, I am, which is a declaration of preexistence, which in the Gospel of John is connected to the idea of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there are things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. That's a very direct statement about the authority of Jesus. But those statements are few and far between. By far, the more common way that Jesus shows his deity is he shows his authority, and he claims authority to do things that God is responsible for. So, for example, when he heals the paralytic, he heals the paralytic by saying that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says the paralytic, get up and walk. And so he takes something that you can't see, forgiveness of sins, no one can see forgiveness of sins, and ties it to something you can see, okay, which is a healing, so that you can be assured of the thing you can't see by the thing you can see. And then, of course, in the background of that passage is the idea no one has authority to forgive sins but God alone. Or Jesus healing on the Sabbath, when they're complaining about him healing on the Sabbath. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So who has authority over the Lord's day but the Lord? Or he's able to calm the winds and the waves. The disciples at the end of that passage ask, who's able to calm the winds and the waves? And they obey him. Or he changes the liturgy of the Passover into a liturgy about his own death. This is liturgy that comes out of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible that were authorized by God. Who has the authority to do that? So the idea here is that Jesus shows his authority by what he does, as often as, and he does combine it with things that he says, but the things that are said point to activities that God performs. And then he shows that authority. And in doing so, he is showing who he is more than talking about who he is. Most people are not aware of that. Most people do not recognize that as a key part of the way in which the Gospels present, particularly the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, present the divinity of Jesus.
Yeah, and well, I think one of Jesus' direct statements was the title Son of Man, right? And this is a title that Jesus liked. Can you explain this a little bit? What was involved in being called in this way?
Yeah, this is a very important title because it doesn't look like what it is. And what I mean by that is Son of Man is basically an idiom. It's a way of saying a son of a human being, which is another way of referring to a human being. Only Jesus liked to use it of himself. And then he connected it to Daniel 7:9-13. In this text, the Son of Man, who's a human being, rides the clouds. Now, in the Hebrew scripture, in the Old Testament, the only one who rides the clouds is God himself, with the exception of this passage. And then the Son of Man receives authority, judgment authority from the Ancient of Days in this text, which means he shares the execution of salvation with God the Father. And so when you put this all together, this is a human being who's doing God stuff. It's the way I like to talk about these indirect passages. Jesus is a human being who's doing stuff only God can do and is exercising authority that only God has. Well, if Jesus is doing stuff as a human being that only God can do and authority that only God has, that tells you something about who he is. He is the God-man.
Another important title is the Messiah. Some of his disciples referred to him as the Messiah. What did this, title mean in that context?
Well, Messiah is a regal term. It talks about the promised one who brings the salvation of God. That's what was anticipated out of the Old Testament. What was not necessarily expected was the idea that the Messiah would be divine. Now, there is the phrase Son of God in the Old Testament that you see in many passages. And in many passages, it's simply a way of referring to the King of Israel, who is God's vice regent on earth and is treated like a family member of the divine family. So, for example, in the Davidic covenant of Solomon and his descendants, it said, I will be to him as a father and he will be to me as a son. Promise of discipline him like a son, that kind of thing. Of course, Jesus didn't commit sin, but Solomon did. And so Son of God is an ambiguous term because it can mean Son of God in that regal sense, or it can mean Son of God in a fuller sense. And part of what the Gospels do is show how the Son of God is actually, in terms of what happens in his life and ministry, the fact that he ends up by resurrection being seated at the right hand of God, he's actually Son of God in the full sense of that term.
When we read the Gospels, we see that many Jews didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah or as God. Even now, there are Jews who reject Jesus. What did the Jews, why did the Jews at that time not accept Jesus as the Messiah or as God?
Well, I think they weren't anticipating a couple of things. One, they certainly weren't anticipating a divine Messiah, and they weren't anticipating a Messiah who would suffer. So even though you have Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament that talks about the suffering before the exaltation of this special figure that Isaiah calls the servant, they weren't anticipating a Messiah who was going to suffer. They were anticipating a Messiah who would strictly be victorious over the nations. And so because their expectations were a little out of line, their recognition was out of line as well. Now, Jesus did a lot of stuff in his ministry to try and correct the misimpression that the Jewish leadership had, but it didn't take, basically. And so for many, and so they never came to understand that the Messiah would suffer, and they didn't understand the Messiah could have divinity in his background. Those were two of the hurdles that I think oftentimes the Jewish leadership couldn't get over. There also was just the practical problem of the Jewish leadership not believing that Jesus could take this role and take the authority and power that they had away from them. So there's that dimension of it as well.
Some people claim that the deity of Jesus cannot be found in the book of Mark, and they use this as an objection, against Jesus' deity. What do you think about this?
Well, again, these events that I've described that are indirect references, they're in Mark. The healing of the paralytic is in Mark. The Jesus saying the Son of Man is Lord in the Sabbath is in Mark. The idea of Jesus proclaiming before the Jewish leadership that you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. You may crucify me, but God's going to resurrect me one day. That's in Mark. So these indirect references that show Jesus doing God kind of stuff, that's in Mark. Jesus changing the liturgy of the Passover into liturgy about his death. That's in Mark as well. The calming of the storm is in Mark. Jesus raising people from the dead is in Mark. So this whole series of godlike authority that Jesus exercises, it's all in Mark.
Great. Yeah, I think one of the most difficult topics to understand in Christology is the incarnation. So how can how can Jesus be God and man at the same time?
I don't know how that works. I just know that it's there, that he gave evidence that it's there, etc. I like to say God is so big that there's some things about him we can't grasp. And so that's, I think, one of them.
Yes, totally. I think the incarnation is part of those mysteries that our human reason cannot fully comprehend, Um, Now, some people mention that the term Theotokos has a relationship and implication with the deity of Jesus. Why? What do you think about that?
Yeah, the role of Mary is disputed among Christians. Catholics will say that Mary is the mother of God, and so that gives her a certain kind of unique authority. Protestants tend not to do this, and the reason is that the deity part of Jesus's existence doesn't come from Mary at all. So Mary is just a servant who bears the child of Jesus. This is very clearly laid out in the Gospel of Luke, in the infancy material, when Mary is hearing the announcement that she's going to bear the Messiah. In fact, Mary is thinking about Jesus primarily as a Messiah. She's not thinking about herself as the mother of God. I once remember being in a devotional where someone was sharing, I wonder what Mary thought being a parent to a child that she was never going to have to correct. And I'm thinking as I'm sitting there, Mary never had that thought because she never thought of Jesus initially in that way, Now, obviously, as he emerged to be a good child, this would have surfaced, but she's not thinking about bearing God. She's thinking about bearing the Christ. And so Mary is an example of someone who is faithfully responsive to God, but she's never put in a position of being, how can I say this, elevated to a status that's kind of right next to Jesus.
Great. Quickly, I would like to be able to answer some common objections to the deity of Jesus. Some people ask, for example, why Jesus cried out on the cross, God, why have you forsaken me? If Jesus himself is God.
Well, because he's crying out of he's responding particularly out of the human side of his existence and the fact that he's in the process of facing death as a human being. He is relating to God throughout his ministry out of the fact that he is a human being who is responsive to and interacting with the Father. It doesn't mean that his deity is not active, but it does mean that some of his responses that we see are a reflection of the human dimension of Jesus' existence. And so he's in at that point, he is depicting the anguish of the death that he is getting ready to face.
Now, how do you respond to Ehrman's objection that Jesus' followers invented his deity years later? Well, he claims, that there is no evidence for Jesus' deity in the first century and things like that.
There would be no reason for later followers of a Jesus who did not show forth his divinity for them to create that category for him. Some people will try and connect it to the way in which Caesar is elevated to divine status in the Greco-Roman world, but that doesn't work because Jesus is in a Jewish context in which there is one God and one God only. Human beings do not become God in Judaism. So there's one element of the objection. The second is there'd be no motivation for them to create this. If Jesus was merely someone who went around saying he was a prophet or a Messiah or at the center of bringing salvation one day, Jesus wouldn't have to be God in order for him to have that role. He could just be resurrected at the end, as most Jews believed, or many Jews believed there was a resurrection at the end, and he could run and reign over the people of God, having been resurrected at the end. But that isn't what the church teaches. The church taught that Jesus was divine, and that this was something that he taught. There's also danger in creating that category. So you wouldn't create it. And if you make Jesus into God and present him as a deity and a challenging ruler to the Roman ruler, all Christians are at risk who argue that in the Greco-Roman world, because only in the Greco-Roman idea, only we approve the emperors. Only we determine who the rulers are. And so to go there without a reason to go there is something that's not safe. It's theologically not coherent with what they believed in the past. So the point is, something had to cause them to do the unusual. And that's something that caused them to do the unusual must have been Jesus's own self-teaching and the character of Jesus's ministry that caused them to go there. There's no cause sufficient to take you there among the followers of Jesus themselves. The only thing that makes sense to take you there is that Jesus took them there.
C.S. Lewis proposed a trilemma regarding Jesus. He's either the Lord, a liar, or a lunatic. Can you mention a little about this trilemma and how it works?
Yeah, well, the whole idea here is that Jesus is either who he claims to be, or he knows that he's not, and he's claiming to be something that he isn't, or he's crazy to think that he's God when he's not. I mean, that's basically the trilemma. I like to tease people, that's too complicated. The way the Bible sets it up is he's from above or he's from below. The debate that he got into with the Jewish leadership, when they recognized he's performing miracles, he's doing things that normal people don't do, is they said, he's casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul. So they're arguing, this is coming by the power of the devil. It's not coming from God. So the choice that the Bible leaves you is he's either from above or he's from below. The one choice the Bible will not leave you is one many take, which is he's a good religious guy, or he's a wise person, or he's a good religious example, or even he's the prophet. None of those options are left to you by the New Testament. Jesus is either who he claims to be and is a close association with God, or he is not. And so that's the way the Bible tends to present the space.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. Now, how would you present the gospel to a person in a very brief way? Sometimes this is difficult for some people.
Well, the main thing that I would say is that Jesus is at the center of God's salvation program. He showed that he was at the center of God's salvation program by raising him from the dead. The dispute that existed when Jesus went into the tomb is Jesus is either a blasphemer who is misleading you about God, or he is the Son of God as he claims. When the tomb went empty on Easter Sunday, that was God's vote in the dispute. And Jesus had indicated that if I'm raised from the dead, I've gone to be at the right hand of God. God is taking me to his side, showing who he is. So the deity of Christ wrapped up into the larger gospel message is God has shown who Jesus is by what Jesus was able to do through his life and ministry and through the resurrection, puts him at the center of God's plan and program of salvation, which he's revealed to us in the Gospels. And so Jesus is the Christ, the one in whom you must believe in order to be saved for the forgiveness of sins.
Awesome. Earlier we talked about some objections about Jesus' deity, but I would like to know what objections you have encountered in the academia, in dealing with non-Christian scholars about this topic, and also how would you respond to these objections?
Well, they tend to challenge it's where you started. They tend to challenge the gospel portrait of Jesus's declarations about himself. They do it through a variety of means, mostly trying to say this is a later imposition of the early church onto Jesus, which is another theme we've also dealt with. So the gospels are reliable. There's no reason for the early church to create a category that Jesus didn't inspire them to create about him, because it makes, remember that Christianity is making Jesus the most unique individual who's ever walked the earth. There's only been one person who's a human being and God incarnate at the same time. So why would you go there unless there was something to drive you there? That's the question that's in the background. And we mean something different than the promotion to deity that takes place with the emperors in the Greco-Roman world. It's not the same thing. What the New Testament shows is that Jesus is a pre-existent being who participated in the creation as well as being God incarnate. No emperor, no matter how high their promotion, gets that high a commendation. Another way I like to say it is, in the Greco-Roman world where there are many gods, an emperor barely makes it into the room with the gods, okay? But Jesus is sitting with the only God there is, okay? There are not other gods in the room. He's the only other one who has this role. So it's very different than the examples in the Greco-Roman world. And something had to take that portrait of Jesus to that space. Something needed to generate that for people who generally didn't think that way. And the gospel answer is, it was the life and ministry of Jesus that did it. And that really is the best explanation for how it could happen.
Right. Now, is there extra-biblical evidence for the deity of Jesus?
We don't have extra biblical evidence to show that Jesus is God. What we do have is extra biblical evidence to show that Jesus existed, that he performed miracles, that he was put to death on a cross, and that Christians believed he was raised from the dead.
Moving onto the end of the interview, was it necessary for Jesus to have a earthly father, Joseph?
Well, I mean, he needed to function in a family. He needed to function in a human way. Most people function by belonging to a family. That would be very common in the first century for sure. And so Jesus functioning with a human father is just a natural part of the human experience.
Great. And well, last question, Dr. Bock. How is it possible for us to have an intimate relationship with the Almighty God?
Well, what Scripture says is that we have a relationship with God. We trust him for what it is he's provided for us. He's provided forgiveness of sins, but not just forgiveness of sins. This is actually very important, because the whole point of forgiving sin is to wash away the uncleanness, the spiritual uncleanness that we have. Because we're clean, now the Spirit of God can come and indwell us, and we can truly become children of God with a relationship with God from the inside out. So the gospel isn't just about forgiveness of sins, nor is the gospel simply about avoiding judgment. The gospel is about entering into a living relationship with the living God, because he gives us his Spirit. He's cleansed us of the penalty and the judgment that comes with sin. He's made us a clean vessel. He comes into our lives through the Holy Spirit, and now we have a relationship with him because we believe that God has done and is doing all those things through Jesus Christ, who offers and provides that forgiveness. And so we come into a relationship with God by trusting him in that relationship. You know, relationships that are healthy involve trust. The theological word for that is faith. I believe in God, what he's done on my behalf, and I trust him as a result. And the trusting part is the daily part.
Great. Well, it has been really a pleasure to be able to talk to you, Dr. Bock. Thank you so much for the work you do in the New Testament area. And again, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Andres.
Yeah, God bless you. God bless your ministry. And yeah, bye.